Good morning everyone, welcome to Our Small Footprint. I have no idea what today's day is because I had that other video yesterday and I think I missed a day somewhere. So we are, this is Saturday's cooking. So we did one of the pork legs today. I cut it all up and canned it into pulled pork, and I cooked the rind off over potatoes like we always do to save the lard, and because potatoes cooked in pork fat's always really tasty. And we made stock and dog food and canned the stock up as well. So I've got all that to share, and I've tried to be a little bit more in-depth about the actual canning processes. It's still not really a how-to video. I have to work on figuring that out for everyone. I've had a lot of requests on, basics on canning and stuff like that, and I will figure it out, but I'm just not sure about how I'm going to show all the details in the way my kitchen's set up. It might be something that I really have to rearrange the kitchen for. So for the moment, this is a little bit more in depth than normal. I went into a little bit more detail, but I pressure canned pork chunks and stock today and a couple of other miscellaneous things. So enjoy watching. Feedback in the comments would be great, and I will see you again tomorrow. Thanks guys, enjoy. Started off the day simple. Started off the day with stock. So we make chicken stock all the time. We still have carcasses from the frozen thighs that I had bought the last couple of months that I couldn't get this month. So we had bags of them frozen in the freezer and stuff. So I grabbed a couple of them out and put some stock on. So I do my stock in my pressure canner, which can also work as a cooker. So a pressure canner can work as a cooker, but a pressure cooker can't always work as a pressure canner. It's a good, thing to remember. I put the chicken bones in there. I also put carrot and some onion and some celery and things like that. I did fairly clear stock this time because I was going to can the stock. Sometimes if I'm making it just for dog food, I will add sweet potato or some zucchini or things like that, but it really makes your stock very cloudy. So because I'm canning this stock, I didn't want to do that. So it's a very clear stock, this one, with plenty of carrots, celery, a couple of onions, a bit of garlic, pepper, salt, and apple cider vinegar in there, and filled up with water and turned on. And I bring it up to pressure and I put the weight on it and I let it go for 90 minutes at pressure. At that point, when I pull it out, you can crumble the bones between your fingers. So then we run it all through the Thermomix. We pull out any large chunks of onion that we see while we're doing it, but we have discussed that there is certain amounts of onion that dogs can eat, and we puree it all up into dog food, and that goes with their dry kibble for their dinners while it lasts. So I try and make it at least once a week, and it goes in a container in the fridge and gets used over that week for them in their food to reduce costs, and it's good for them. For brunch today, because Darryl and I generally eat breakfast at sort of 10 or 11 o'clock in the morning, I had some leftover flatbread dough from the other day. It's been in the fridge, so it's a little bit sticky, but it's still usable. It's a little bit sour too because it's sourdough, but it's still usable. So I rolled that out and fried it up, and we had some leftover smoked pork belly strips that I had made the night before, so I sliced them thin and warmed them up, and we had them over the flatbread dough with a little bit of ghee. I had a little bit of Parmesan cheese with mine. Darryl had a bit of salt and garlic, and we just had them for brunch while we were getting on with everything else. The next task of the day I started was one of the pork legs. So we bought 3 this month. One of them blew the vacuum seal, so that's the one that I'm processing now. The other 2 have dates that go into August. So I'm waiting on my sausage casings to turn up, and once they turn up, we'll do both of those into sausages. But for this one, I decided I would can it. So I pulled it out of the fridge. I've removed all the rind from the pork. If you've watched any of my other food prep series, we do this for at least one of them every month. So I remove all the rind from the pork because I don't want to use that for canning. And once I remove all the rind, we cook it over potatoes. So carefully remove all the rind. Because I'm canning this pork, I'm taking most of the fat with the rind. If I was making it into sausages, I'd leave a fair bit of the fat behind because you want that with the sausages. Then the bags of baby potatoes I bought were purely for this, so I cut them in half and filled trays with them. I use my cast iron enamel trays here because I'm going to put them in the wood stove. And I put a whole layer of potatoes in the bottom of the tray. Once the potatoes are all in the bottom of the tray, I slice the rind up. So you want to slice it into sort of narrow strips, not too long, because you want it to cook in the same, you want it to render the fat down and crisp up in the same time it takes to cook the potatoes. So if you cut it too large, when you pull it out, the potatoes are cooked, but you've still got a fair bit of fat on that rind, and we want that fat in the pan so that we can save it. So I slice them up narrow, fairly short, and then I put them on a single layer over the top of the potatoes so that the rind is exposed to the heat, so it'll crisp up like rind will, but the fat will render down into the potatoes. So the potatoes will be really tasty, but we can also pour that fat off into a jar later as well. I pour a little bit of oil on top of the rind and salt it because we're going to eat it, so we want it tasty, but the oil helps it to crisp up quickly as well. And then that's ready to go. What I decided to do with the rest of it was to put it in jars. We've only got 2 jars of pork on the shelf, and we really enjoy having these on the shelf. So what I do is I cut it into chunks. You want the chunks fairly large because this is basically pulled pork, and if the chunks are too small it just sort of falls apart too much. So you want the chunks fairly large, but you also want to be able to pack as much into a jar as possible. So if it's too large, you're going to have too many gaps. So you want it sort of narrow and long is what I find the best to shove it in there. I put a sprinkle of bacon and a teaspoon of salt about halfway up the jar. That's personal preference. Bacon is not necessarily approved for canning, so that is definitely a personal preference thing, but we're basically making Kahlua pork in a jar is how we look at it. So we put a sprinkle of bacon, a teaspoon of salt about halfway in of the jar. You want it well packed in there. As said, you want the fairly large chunk, and you don't put any liquid in it because it creates its own liquid. So you're dry packing, raw packing this pork, and it will cook itself in its own juices. And when you go to open them, you generally drain those juices off because otherwise it will cooking in its juices rather than like heating up as a fried pulled pork. But you can pour, if you're putting it into a soup or something, you'd put the juices in as well. Once the jars are packed evenly, I can fit 8 of these jars in my buffalo canner, so I managed to spread that pork out and get it all into 8 of those jars. You pack it really well because it will shrink down, so it looks over full, but it all shrinks down when it cooks. So this will still end up being a fairly full jar, but it won't be too full when it's processed. Once they're all packed in, I've cleaned the rims with white vinegar. You want to be careful to make sure there's no bits of meat around the rims. These are Fowler's for cola jars, so we're actually really careful about cleaning the outside edge of the jars, not just the top of the jars like you would with a ball mason, because we're putting rubber rings on these. So you need to clean the whole top of the jar. So a cloth, white vinegar, give the whole top of the jar a really good clean. And then these are the rubber rings that go on Fowler's jars, and they fit in a little ridge on the side of the jar. So you have to get the rings on the jar and make sure that they're all even. You don't want them twisted anywhere. You want them all nice and straight and even into the little rim on the side of the jar. Once I've done that, I tend to run the vinegar cloth around the rings as well because it's dusty and dirty here, and I like to just make sure. So I just run the cloth with a bit of vinegar on it around the outside of the rings as well before I put the lids on. Then the lids for Fowler's are reusable. They are a stainless steel lid, and there's different sizes for different size bottles. These are a size 4. So you place all the lids on top of the jars, make sure they're nice and straight. Once they're straight, you put the clips on which holds the lids to the rubber so that it can create a seal. Now Fowler's only recommends 1 clip, but all of my stuff is secondhand. My clips are fairly stretched, and I find 2 is good for pressure canning personally. I like to put 2 on because I find that if I don't get 1 really evenly placed, and if it's a stretched one, then I have lids that tilt and don't seal properly, so I use 2. Again, personal choice on that one. The jars go in the canner. The water is cold because the jars are cold, or room temperature. So I place the jars into cold water in the canner and make sure that there's enough movement around the jars. When you don't want them stacked in so that they can't move at all. So I just wanted to make sure that with the 8 jars and the way the lids work in these jars, that they would still have enough room to move as they needed to. So they all have plenty of movement in them. So then I put the lid on and started it up. So you start the heat up and then you wait for the steam to vent in a steady stream out the top. You want the steam to vent for 10 minutes before you place the weight on. So after the 10 minutes, you just pop the weight on away from you, obviously, because you don't want to send steam to yourself. And then once the weight goes on, you then wait for it to start rocking. So once the weight is rocking, you know that the inside of the canner is at pressure, and so it's the weight is rocking to release a little bit of pressure to maintain the pressure that it's at. This is a 15-pound weight that's on this one. So once it starts rocking, you start the timer. And for a quart of meat, it's 90 minutes. This is where we were cooking the potatoes, in the wood stove. Ignore the bad lighting, I keep on standing getting my shadow in it because the sun is behind me, but this is the wood stove that we're using. It is a Fornetto. We got it second hand before we moved out here, so 5 years ago. I don't think they make them anymore. And we have the cast iron trays in there on 2 layers. We do have to rotate them because the heat from the top helps crisp the rind up, and if you don't swap them over, then the top one will overcook and the bottom one won't go crispy. So we do swap them over, but it's still using wood rather than using the gas, which is what we were aiming for. And this is what the potatoes and the rind look like cooked. So when you get it out of the oven, you want to move the potatoes and the rind out of the trays as quickly as possible. Otherwise, the potatoes will soak back up all that lard, and you won't be able to put it in a jar. So you want to get the potatoes up out of the lard so that they don't soak it all up. So we put it on a rack above it, and then we pour all the lard off into our bacon fat jar to use for later. This lard isn't particularly clean. This is what we call our dirty jar, and we use this to fry off in and things like that. We don't use it for baking or tortillas or things like that. This is what the pork jars look like once they're done. So once the 90 minutes was up, I turned the canner off. You wait for I forgot to film that. You wait for the little red knob, there's a little silver one on a Presto, to drop back down, and that tells you that there's no pressure left in the canner after that. And then you take the weight off, and then you crack the lid and wait for 5 minutes, and then take the lid off, and then you can get the jars out. So this is what they look like. We use these for everything. It's basically just pulled pork. You just open the jar, drain it off, fry it off, and we have it on pizza, in tacos, on flatbreads, on quesadillas, on anything we feel like having. It's just basically like pulling pulled pork out of the fridge. When you get the jars out, they'll still be bubbling inside. That is normal. That is the pressure inside the jars and the heat and stuff still just equalizing to outside. So you actually want them to be bubbling, and you find that if you've got one that isn't bubbling, generally speaking, that one, when you test the seals in the morning, won't have sealed. Next, I had to strain the stock so that I could can it while the canner was still hot. So we strain off the solids for the dogs, as I said. That will go in the Thermomix and will be pureed to a paste, and then I use the clear stock for canning. I'm not particularly pedantic about straining my stock. I'm just using a plastic colander, but you can use cloth and stuff if you want a really clear stock. But yeah, and some people cool their stock and then skim the fat and then reheat it, but we actually like the fat in it. I probably overfilled these jars slightly, forgetting that I hadn't strained the fat off it, and I did get a little bit of siphoning, but that's fine. They still all sealed, so it's all good. So yeah, so I filled the quarts with the hot stock. I should have left a little bit extra headspace. I didn't, but I wasn't thinking about it at the time. Because the canner is still hot, it was worth doing these jars now, because they can just go into the hot canner from the pork, and I can use the heat and the water that's already there to do that. So filled them all up, and then I cleaned the rims with vinegar. You need to be careful to clean the rims of these because the stock is fatty, so you want to make sure you get any fat off the surface, and you're wanting to clean the top of the rims of these jars because they're ball mason jars. That's the most important spot for the lids to attach to. That's where the rubbers touch, is the top rim, not the sides. So you clean the rims really well on the jars, and then place the lids on top. This is the very last of my regular sized ball lids. I have some 4 jars lids ordered from Amazon that I'm going to give a go because everyone in America is trying them and they seem to work really well. Once the lids are on, you put the rings on. So you want to the rings have to go on finger tight on all the jars. You don't want to over tighten them, so just use your fingertips, not the palm of your hand. And once the rings are on, I place them in the canner. So the stock is hot, the water in the canner is hot, so we placed them in there at the same temperature. Once they're in the canner, the lid goes on and we go through the same process. So we wait for the canner to start venting in a steady stream. Once it's going in a steady stream, we start a timer for 10 minutes. Once the 10 minutes is up, we place the weight on top of the canner. Again, this is a 15-pound weight. And once the weight starts to rock, then we start the timer for how long we want to can the goods. So clear stock without any solids in it, in quarts, is 25 minutes. Then you have altitude adjustments. So we add 5 minutes on for our altitude here. So set the timer, and then the same process once it is finished. Once the timer is finished, we turn the heat off. Wait for the pressure gauge to drop so that there's no pressure left in it. Remove the weight, crack the lid, leave it for 5 minutes, then take the lid off and pull the jars out onto a board. So this is what the jars looked like when they came out. As you can see, they did siphon just a little bit. My own fault. I wasn't thinking about it when I filled them, but they should still seal fine. And if they don't, then we will have something with stock for dinner in the next day or so. We'll just stick them in the fridge and use them, and it will be all good. So that was everything for today. Thank you for joining me again, and I will see you again tomorrow. Thanks, guys.